and I'll try to get the big ones that we still contend we have a lot to deal with today. But this one also dealt with a lot of the disciplinary matters in the church. When I say disciplinary matters, is like you shall not have more than 2 snuff boxes type deals, type disciplines. And sometimes it's more reforming clergy, reforming church practices. Especially at needs of time. Like I mentioned earlier, like you can't have concubineages, you can't have wives, you can't do this. You can't have kept mistresses. Oddly enough, they had to talk about that. But there you go. Each century has its own problems. Some of them reoccur. So there you go. So that was in 1215. Now we have the First Council of Lyon. This one, obviously, not in Italy. Sort of, kind of things are shifting. But this occurred with. This was really confusing, actually, because you had there was a lot going on politically that was happening. There wasn't a whole lot of things that were doctrinal, other than the excommunications as well of another weird little heresy that came up. But this one excommunicated Frederick II, the emperor, because he was basically trying to kill Pope. Get excommunicated, try to kill Pope and take over. So you just don't do that. And it also talked about a new crusade that was going to come up under the command of St. Louis of France, King of France, against the Saracens and, as I'd say, the Mongol hordes that were invading, Attila and his lot and all that. It wasn't specifically Attila, but his descendants. Then we have, I'm not really sure how to pronounce this because they keep wanting to say Vienna, but it's not Vienna. It's Vienne, and it's in France. Vienne, that's in 1311 to 1313. This was in France. And this is the one where I talked about that had to do with the Knights of the Templars. There was many kings who were there. I mean, you had King of France, you had the King of England, you had Edward II of England, James II of Aragon, and so you're seeing the kingdoms in kind of collecting, getting around one another, because you can later see that Aragon and England not so happy partners later on in the centuries, because Catherine of Aragon's situation and Henry and all that lovely mess. So this one was discussed was the suppression of the Templars, not in ecumenical fashion. So there's one that's not ecumenical. The council itself was, but some actions were not. The Pope at the time, which was his name? Clement V. He investigated the Templars because people were saying, oh, they're guilty of this, that, and the other, and he looked through, and he had a second one to look through it, and he had a third one to look through it, to thoroughly go through finances, to go through, what their doctrine, their teaching was, everything was okay. He found absolutely no problem. Everything was on par, everything was fine, but then the King of France got involved, and another king got involved. So what happened was basically these different groups were threatening basically to rip the empire apart into horrible bloody wars that would have been terrible. So what the Pope did at the moment was to suppress, which didn't mean to, say they're all heretics or they're guilty of immorality or something like that. It just meant that, okay guys, I'm going to dissolve this. You can transform yourself into something else, but to prevent civil war in Europe, I'm going to just suppress you, which is not, a big smack in the face. It's just like, okay, because I got to fix this somehow. Because the Pope didn't want to have that weighing on the church and on his conscience, like, oh, I caused the death of millions because of the Civil War. But after that happened, the King of France decided to take it upon himself to start executing them all, so it ended badly, and the Pope was like, what are you doing? So, again, there would have been more excommunications, come to Jesus moments with the popes and the bishops. So we had that, but also it renewed the efforts to call another crusade, another disciplinarian, but also a reformation of the clergy and getting more standards, especially producing school of languages, and Oriental languages, as they say, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and then so on and so forth, and the education of clergy and free schools for clergy. Then we have the Council of Constance in 1414, and lasted 4 years till 1418. This had to do with what was called the Great Schism in the West. We had more than one pope that you wanted to deal with, and so it was like, which pope is which? But everybody knew who the real pope was at the moment. But this was to end I believe there were three popes at once. 2 were anti-popes, 1 was not. So this one obviously called the council. And eventually we get through that Martin V, Pope Martin V, because after all the wrangling that had gone on between the various people claiming to be pope, they all resigned, or at one point one died and then became a successor, and then we had again. But they resigned, or one refused to resign, so they knew, okay, you're not the pope. So we had, well, I mean, really, it's like, I will not resign for the sake of the church. Hubris, anybody? Okay, so we have Pope Martin V, who's the real pope, and he comes through and again reaffirms all the councils past and squashed the odd heresy or 2. Okay, now we have, this council has 3 names because they had to run from various areas. It's the Council of Blase, Ferrara, and Florence. So we have, they first met in the town of Blase with Pope Eugene. Then they had to, although this object was the kind of the reeling in of factions in the Bohemian region. But because it was nearby, they had to flee. So it went to Ferrara in 1438. So they had to run because they're being threatened, got to leave town, because we have that many bishops in one place, tempting target for certain people, so got to run. Then again, they had to move again to Florence in 1439. So each year they had to run, for the most part. Where actually in Florence there was a short-lived reunion with the Eastern Church. So that was one of the great importance, was there was a very short-lived union with the church. Again, there were groups that remained in union with Rome after that situation, because it was affirmed and everybody was ecstatic, because I was like, oh good, we were reunited again after so many 100 years. And then again through politics on one side or the other, it kind of fell through. But still with the understanding that everybody's sacraments are valid, we're good on that front, but there's still some issues. Then we move on to the Fifth Lateran Council from the years 1512 to 1517, so a 2-year council under Popes Julius and Leo X. And this one is mostly just disciplinary and reaffirmation of the previous councils. There was not really a lot to deal with at that moment, but it was kind of necessary because in Germany, Luther was starting to get his stuff together, and they had to talk about issues and disciplinary matters of the church and addressing those that were cropping up that Luther had rightly kind of pointed out. So, ought not to be selling indulgences, things like that. Simony is not a good thing. So, or simony, however you want to say it. But also discussing how, because of the Turkish Empire or the Ottoman Empire, were kept coming over and was attacking the Eastern churches in that area, which are actually remaining pretty solid to Rome at that time. But they discussed that in Luther, reaffirmed the councils, but then Luther didn't get dealt with until the next council, which was the Council of Trent, a really big one. This is one of the Well, at this point, the Council of Trent was the most important one since the first ones that we got the understanding of the Trinity. The reason being, it was the most successful council that had, other than Nicaea and the beginning, that had ever been at this point. I mean, literally, it was, the reason I say it's big is because we all know about it to some degree because we use the same language. Transubstantiation, understanding the validity, the matter and form of each sacrament, and understanding how it all works, how it makes it valid, what makes it invalid, because this is the time where the Protestant Reformation is in big breakout. So they're having to reaffirm every single principle, every single doctrine, every single thing inside the church. So it's very, very long, and you can actually have the Catechism of the Council of Trent, really good resource, because it says, it talks about a question, okay, it was discussed this, but this is how we can explain it. And it explains it step by step of why this is what it is. And it's very thorough, which I find very helpful. And you'll see the first and second Vatican Councils both cite Trent to no end. So Trent was incredibly important, and I can't even, there's no way. We'd have to do a whole 3 classes on Trent to get through that. But it basically refuted all those Protestant errors and reaffirmed the Eucharist. And also in disciplinary things, it said that all priests had to go to school. Seminaries had to be invented. West seminaries, they would go to private schools, universities. It's like, this kind of fixed some of the problems that have been happening for a long time, with people coming up with weird, crazy things. But we introduced, seminaries were introduced, which was actually talked about in pre-Reformation England by St. John Fisher. And actually St. Charles and Charles and Bellarmine were involved, I believe. But John Fisher was actually considered one of the fathers of the church, even though he had been martyred at that point, because a lot of the things that went over, he had spoken directly about and was actually one of the onuses in kind of building up to the council, because his notes were extensively used, especially on the Eucharist and the priesthood.
Paul, you have a question?
Yes.
Father, did any of these councils ever address social issues? Like slavery or oppression of the poor?
Those usually came out as papal bulls.
Side issues of the councils?
They came out usually as direct from the Pope or from smaller groups. Like slavery was addressed and condemned, actually multiple times. And other issues.
They condemned slavery. Whoopee.
It's like these were the early times of the church. And they didn't come out as papal bulls, meaning that you will listen. If you won't listen to the council, you'll listen to me. And so you get to put a stamp on things like that. And sort of like the issues that when we deal with today, they'll usually go through with a letter or a encyclical, bringing up specific points, as you said, at that specific time.
Okay, then with these papal bulls, they would include things like the church declaring that if you ate meat on Friday, you would commit a grievous mortal sin and go directly to hell if you died at that point. And the same way with establishing holy days, regardless of whether they were in Europe or in the United States. Was this part of the paper? Did the Pope have to approve of these kind of regulations that were man-made?
Yeah, those regulations would be disciplinary ones and could change with time. Basically, for example, the whole thing with the no meat on Friday situation, in Lent, if you do it knowing full well that you're not supposed to, it's still considered a mortal sin.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do it on accident, which you're liable to do, make the mornings like, oh. But those things will be dealt with in smaller groups or synods that would kind of come out every so often, and the liturgical disciplines of the church, things like that. Another, like in Trent, obviously, would be what sometimes referred to as the Mass of Trent, or I can't even remember the word now, the Tridentine Mass, because we don't call it Tridentine Mass anymore. But that was also when a disciplinary situation happened, where there were so many usages in the church that it was so confusing. One city would have their usage, and then you have another with their usage. Or a diocese, like in England, they had like 4 or 5. You had one of Lancaster, one of Salisbury, one of, you name it, one of York.
So they unified the liturgy.
They unified the liturgy, except with the exception of Eastern churches and those that have been established for a very long length of time, which is usually considered 300 to 400 years long. That's how Milan kept the Ambrosian rite. What time do we got right now?
27.
Oh, okay. We got a few minutes. So we'll flip on really quickly. The next council actually was the first Vatican Council. Since we had the Council of Trent ended in 1563, we jumped several hundred years ahead to 1869, where we have the first Vatican Council, where among other things it affirmed the infallibility of the Pope when he spoke in Ex Cathedra, speaking with infallibility only in Ex Cathedra when it comes to offhand comments, not infallible. John Paul II had a couple of those. He spoke, reaffirmed, defined, because you'll know when they do this, because they'll say, I affirm, declare, define, I mean, they make it in no uncertain terms. It's like they're standing in front of you with a gigantic crozier, hat and all. I am defining and telling you this is what this means. I believe the last time that they did this was in St. John Paul II, specifically with the ordination of women, saying that he hath not the authority, nor does any pope or prelate have the authority to do ordination of women, because Christ never spoke of it and never was ever been precedent in the church. So that was reformation of the infallible use of the pope. Other ones, Immaculate Conception. After consultation, they had the Immaculate Conception and so on and so forth. So this had been in the past. They've used, ex cathedra, but it's not been council, fully stamped until someone tried to challenge, until it's been challenged. So that also went over understanding of the use of Scripture, which had beautiful discussion of the Holy Scriptures, understanding of how interpretation of it, even set up the commission until the 1950s, I think it was, on the Biblical Council, which those with authority of the Pope would say, okay, this is true, you have to, this is a faith, this is a faith, this is a faith. This you can take either way, it's open to interpretation. For example, one of them would be affirmed that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So things like that, where like, this is what the church has always taught from the beginning, therefore we put our stamp on it. However, after that point, they stopped being under papal authority, meaning that, okay, whatever you say and I approve of, stamp. We got it. Now it's more of a academic advisory to the papal, to the church in general, and they come out with numerous decrees, not decrees, but counsels and explanations and understandings and sometimes cautions, let's not get too far with this, which then you have Venerable Pius XII actually talked a lot about that in his writings. He's almost going to be saint soon, eventually, hopefully. Me and Cardinal Regali are just like, please. Anyway, so we had the First Vatican Council and approved, reaffirmed papal infallibility. And humbly enough, we had the first American bishop show up to this one. So it was the first council that had Americans, Canadians, South Americans. But we always had this little thing, it's like, yeah, we follow the Pope at Kenrick Seminary in St. Louis, but Bishop Kenrick didn't really want to vote for papal infallibility. Like, we're going to skip over that in our history. So, but it was basically, there was only he came around, obviously. But I think the Bishop of Arkansas didn't get the memo, which caused an embarrassment. But that got fixed as well. And then we have the Second Vatican Council, which its nature was very different from any other council because it didn't really issue much of any of the, there was no, well, since we just had a council, there was nothing really coming up that needed to be addressed, as in heresies or whatnot, but this was more of a, as I refer to as a pastoral council. Now, there are some documents that are binding and some that are not. And I've debated so much which ones aren't. But the Constitution of the Second Vatican Council, but they're basically, the Second Vatican Council rehashed and reaffirmed all the councils, all its previous ones, and basically explained them the way that they thought would be understandable to people of the modern times. So it was more of the, let's explain this in a fashion that more people get up and understand in more modern language. And there were some disciplinary things that took place like with the other ones. And the liturgy was not changed at the Second Vatican Council. That didn't happen until afterwards. Because people were like, well, what was the liturgy of the Second Vatican Council? That would be the extraordinary form in Latin and all we think of. Because that didn't change until almost 1970, but into St. Paul the Sixth. Yes, Sixth.
He's not a saint yet.
He's not? Okay, blessed.
Blessed Paul is.
Blessed Paul the Sixth. And that didn't happen until the late 60s. And again, the discipline of the church, so we could get a pope elected tomorrow if, God forbid our Holy Father would pass. And if they ever have conflict, that's
Father, we had
Okay.
we had basically meetings on every one of the 4 constitutions of Vatican II, and if people really want to know what they're about, they can go back and those videos are on the website.
Okay.
So if they want to look up Dei Verbum, it's on the website. So also is the other 3, and I can't remember the names offhand, but they were all 4 are on there.
So basically,
I think there's a class started. Yeah.
I'm Dave Urban, with yeah, obviously. Yes, you should know more about that.
I don't know about it.
I'm sorry. Yeah, but that's the 21, and yes.
In terms of all of what we just heard,
Mhm.
where along the way did we actually change from all Latin to, in our case,
The
English?
vernacular. It was, the discussion of vernacular was actually discussed well before the Second Vatican Council. And actually through Pius XII, he promulgated a document saying that the readings could be in the vernacular. The priest would say, at the proper time in Latin, but then the deacon would get up during those times and would be reading the readings in the vernacular language. So already that was kind of taking place, but that changeover didn't happen until I think it was 1967.
Somewhere in there, it's the early
Is
70s.
when they kind of switched to the
No problem. I go back to my RCIA history of the church and around 60, 65, it's just plotting well with what you're saying. But what you're saying is going to individual languages versus Latin is a gradual process.
Yeah, because Greek, if you're a Greek Catholic, you need to have Greek. And so, St. Thomas Aquinas actually affirmed that he said that it didn't really, the language as in the word specific, as in, say, at the Eucharist, the words of Constitution, those words matter, the meaning. However, what language it is in, like if it was in French or English or German, that really wouldn't change it. However, at that time, before, it would be illicit as all get out. It'd be valid, but very, very illicit.
What I'm getting from all this is it's kind of fuzzy if you look at it globally as to when various countries wound up doing their masses in their language.
Yeah,
What
that's-
time? Yeah, probably in our case, English was probably pretty well early on the bat, like maybe French or Greek say, but.
It has a complicated history, let's just say it, let's just put it that way,
Yeah.
because that would actually be for another time, because boy, is it
Okay.
complicated.
Somewhere.
Okay, that's fine, okay. I think we're about out of time. Yeah.
You want to close with prayer, Father, please?
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son,
and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.